It's dawn of May 1940. German panzer divisions are cutting through France at impossible speeds. Infantry marching 25 miles a day, then fighting through the night. French commanders can't react. British forces retreat to Dunkirk. The blitzkrieg seems unstoppable. There's a reason for that. The German military is running on meth. 35 million Pervitin tablets distributed in 1940 alone, concentrated in the mechanized spearheads. Tank commanders in Guderian's corps operating for 50 hours without sleep. The drug suppresses fear, eliminates exhaustion, maintains aggression when outnumbered. This wasn't a secret. It was tactical pharmacology, but Germany wasn't the only army with an edge. The Americans brought firepower so overwhelming they could bury positions under steel before infantry ever moved forward. The Soviets went from losing 4 million men in 6 months to fielding the most experienced, most brutal army in the world. The British fought with surgical precision, born from the knowledge that every casualty mattered. And the Japanese refused to surrender, turning every island into a graveyard. 5 armies, 5 completely different systems of violence. Here's what made each one lethal, and which was actually best. If you want to understand the tactics and systems that shaped World War II combat, hit subscribe. This channel breaks down the mechanics of warfare that history classes skip. The early dominance of the Wehrmacht came from 3 things: decentralized command, superior tactics, and chemical enhancement. The 35 million Pervitin tablets weren't distributed evenly across the entire 3 million man invasion force. They were concentrated where they mattered most: Guderian's 19th Panzer Corps and the Luftwaffe bomber crews. Tank commanders used it to push through the Ardennes for 36 to 50 hours without stopping. This continuous pressure disrupted the French command cycle. By the time French generals understood where the attack was coming from, German tanks were already 30 miles behind their lines. Pilots used it for long-range bombing missions over Britain. Infantry in the spearhead units used it to march faster than the enemy could retreat. The drug worked. German soldiers operated at peak performance for days. But by 1941, the costs became clear: addiction, psychosis, cardiovascular collapse. Soldiers who'd been on Pervitin for months were breaking down mentally and physically. The Wehrmacht scaled back distribution. By 1942, the chemical edge that fueled the early blitzkrieg was gone. German infantry had to fight without it. Drugs weren't the real advantage, though. The real secret was how the Germans commanded their forces. In our previous video, we discussed Auftrags tactic, mission-type orders. German officers told subordinates what needed to be done, not how to do it. A lieutenant on the front line could change tactics immediately if the situation demanded it. No waiting for permission. No radio call to headquarters. If a flanking attack wasn't working, switch to frontal assault. If outnumbered, disengage without orders. This made German units adaptable in ways their enemies couldn't match. Compare this to the Soviet system in 1941, where officers were shot for retreating without permission, even when staying meant certain death. German squads were built around one weapon: the machine gun. Early war, the MG-34. By 1942, the MG-42, 1,200 rounds per minute. It sounded like a buzzsaw tearing through metal. Allied soldiers called it Hitler's buzzsaw because the psychological effect was as deadly as the bullets. The entire squad existed to feed that gun ammunition and protect the gunner. When attacking, it pinned enemies while riflemen flanked. When defending, squads waited until the enemy was at point-blank range, then opened fire. By 1944, Germany introduced something that changed infantry combat forever: the Sturmgewehr 44, the world's first assault rifle. It gave riflemen automatic fire with actual range. German infantry could now suppress entire squads without needing a machine gun. But the weapon almost didn't exist. Hitler rejected it, insisting bolt-action rifles were sufficient. Designers continued development in secret, disguising it as a machine carbine. By the time Hitler approved mass production, Germany's industrial capacity was collapsing. Most infantry still carried bolt-action rifles until the war ended. But Germany's real advantage wasn't weapons, it was the system. German sergeants and corporals were trained to think like officers. They understood the broader tactical picture. They could read terrain, anticipate enemy movements, make decisions without waiting for orders. If a German officer was killed, the senior NCO took over and the mission continued. Soviet units in 1941 often fell apart when their officers died because the men hadn't been trained to think independently. In 1940, the Wehrmacht was the most lethal fighting force in the world. By 1945, they were defending Berlin with teenagers and old men. Attrition changed everything. The Eastern Front consumed the best soldiers. Stalingrad alone cost 300,000 men, most of them veterans. By 1943, experienced NCOs were being replaced by recruits with weeks of training. The quality collapsed. But even in 1945, German soldiers remained dangerous. American Colonel Trevor Dupuy analyzed combat data and found that German troops inflicted 50% more casualties than they suffered, even when outnumbered, even when defending, even when losing. Man for man, the Wehrmacht was the most tactically effective infantry of the war. But tactics don't win wars when you're fighting the entire industrialized world. And that's what the Germans were about to learn the hard way. The American philosophy was simple. Don't send men where you can send steel. The United States was the only nation to equip its entire infantry with a semi-automatic rifle as standard issue. Other armies had semi-automatics, Germany's Gewehr 43, the Soviet SVT 40, but only in limited numbers. Most German, Soviet and British infantry still carried bolt-action rifles throughout the war. The M1 Garand fired as fast as you could pull the trigger. 8 rounds, semi-automatic, accurate, reliable. General Patton called it the greatest battle implement ever devised. German soldiers facing American infantry in Normandy reported being overwhelmed by the sheer firepower. They couldn't keep up. An American squad of 12 men, all armed with M1s, could generate sustained suppressive fire without relying on a single machine gun. This made them more resilient than German squads. Killing the BAR gunner didn't cripple the unit. The Browning automatic rifle was the weak point. It was designed for World War I trench warfare, not mobile combat. 20-round magazine, no quick-change barrel. It overheated quickly and couldn't sustain fire like the MG42 or the Bren. But American doctrine compensated. The M1s provided covering fire while the BAR maneuvered. The most decisive American weapon wasn't a rifle or machine gun, though. It was artillery. The US developed the Fire Direction Center system, which allowed a single forward observer to call fire from multiple batteries simultaneously. Time on target missions coordinated dozens of guns, so every shell landed at the exact same second. No warning, no time to take cover. The proximity fuse, introduced in late 1944, allowed shells to detonate at a precise height above the ground using primitive radar. This turned every artillery round into an airburst that shredded infantry in trenches. American expenditure was staggering. The Third Army alone fired over 5 million rounds. During the Battle of the Bulge, the First Army fired 1.2 million rounds in 4 weeks. The U.S. industrial base produced over 25 million 105mm rounds in 1942 alone. This was the American way of war. Bury the enemy under high explosives before infantry ever moves forward. For every American soldier on the front line, multiple men supported him in logistics. The Red Ball Express, a convoy system that supplied the advance across France in 1944, moved over 12,000 tons of supplies per day. German panzers ran out of fuel. American tanks didn't. That's not tactics. That's systems. In 1942, American infantry were inexperienced. They made mistakes. They took unnecessary casualties. By 1945, they'd learned German tactics, mastered combined arms, and could execute complex operations independently. They never matched German man-for-man skill. They didn't need to, because in a war of attrition, logistics beats tactics every time. But there was one army that turned attrition into a weapon itself. June 1941. The Red Army is a disaster. 4 million casualties in 6 months, entire armies encircled, mass surrenders. By May 1945, everything had transformed. The Red Army had become the most combat-hardened force in the world. When Germany invaded, the Red Army was in chaos. Stalin's Great Purge in 1937-1938 had executed or imprisoned 90% of experienced officers. The men who replaced them were loyal but incompetent. Soviet doctrine in 1941 was rigid. Officers couldn't retreat without permission, even when staying meant death. Tactics were crude. Frontal assaults, human waves, no coordination between infantry, tanks, and artillery. The results were predictable. Millions dead or captured in the first months. But the Soviets learned. After Stalingrad, they implemented deep battle doctrine. Simultaneous attacks across the entire depth of enemy defenses. Front lines, reserves, artillery positions, supply depots, all hit at once. The goal wasn't to break through in one place, it was to overload the enemy's ability to respond. Soviet commanders became masters of deception. Entire tank armies moved at night to create overwhelming local superiority where the enemy didn't expect it. Soviet squads copied German tactics. They reduced squad size and increased firepower. The DP-27 light machine gun became the centerpiece, just like the German MG-42. And they mass-produced the PPSH-41 submachine gun. Simple stamped steel construction, 71-round drum magazine, perfect for close quarters. By 1945, entire Soviet battalions were equipped with submachine guns, creating specialized assault forces for urban warfare. The Red Army prioritized artillery above everything else. At the Battle of Berlin, they concentrated over 250 guns per kilometer of front, the most intense barrage in history. Over 41,000 guns fired 1.2 million shells on the first day alone. No other battle matched this density of fire. American artillery relied on precision and coordination. Soviet artillery relied on overwhelming mass. Both worked. By 1945, Soviet infantry weren't just experienced. They were veterans of the most brutal combat in human history. They'd seen their country devastated, cities burned, families murdered. When they crossed into Germany, they fought with a hatred that terrified German soldiers. The Red Army committed atrocities on a massive scale: essay, looting, executions. This wasn't official policy, but it wasn't stopped either. Soviet casualties exceeded 8 million dead. But they won. By 1945, the Red Army had transformed from catastrophe to conquest. More artillery than anyone, more experience than anyone, more rage than anyone. They were unstoppable, but not every army could rely on overwhelming numbers and industrial might. The British fought the entire war under one unbreakable rule: we cannot afford heavy casualties. World War I had cost Britain nearly 1 million men. The public wouldn't tolerate that again, so British tactics became an exercise in precision and firepower over manpower. British infantry training was the most realistic in the war. Live rounds fired over trainees' heads, so they learned the difference between a gun firing and a bullet hitting nearby. This created soldiers who didn't panic under fire. British doctrine emphasized small, deliberate advances. Consolidate positions. Don't take unnecessary risks. The Lee Enfield was the fastest bolt-action rifle of the war. The pre-World War I Mad Minute standard was 15 aimed rounds at 300 yards. Skilled soldiers could exceed this. But comparing it to the M1 Garand is misleading. A semi-automatic action is inherently faster than any bolt action, no matter how smooth. The Lee Enfield was the best bolt-action rifle, but the M1 Garand was still superior in volume of fire. The Bren light machine gun was arguably the finest of its class. Quick-change barrel, 30-round top-mounted magazine, exceptional accuracy. Unlike the American BAR, the Bren could sustain fire without overheating. British squads were built around it, just like German squads around the MG-42. British infantry excelled at coordination with tanks, artillery, and engineers. When they attacked, tanks moved with them. Artillery suppressed enemy positions. Specialized vehicles cleared mines and obstacles. This required extensive planning and communication. British infantry were slower to adapt when plans changed, but the system worked because it preserved lives. By 1944, Britain had reached full mobilization. They were forced to disband entire divisions just to provide replacements for other units. Montgomery's cautious approach, criticized by American officers as too slow, was a rational response to demographic reality. Britain couldn't replace losses the way America or the Soviet Union could, so they fought smart instead of aggressive. But one army fought with neither caution nor overwhelming firepower. They fought with something else entirely. The Imperial Japanese Army fought with something none of the other forces possessed: absolute willingness to die. Japanese soldiers were indoctrinated from enlistment. Surrender was the ultimate disgrace. Captured soldiers dishonored their families, their ancestors, their emperor. Death in battle was honorable. Surrender was not. This wasn't propaganda. They genuinely believed it. On Iwo Jima, only 216 of approximately 21,000 defenders surrendered during the battle. That's a 99% casualty rate. Compare this to German or Italian forces, where surrender rates reached 20 to 30% when positions became untenable. Early in the war, Japanese infantry relied on aggressive night infiltration and bayonet charges. These worked against unprepared Allied troops in Malaya and Burma, but against American firepower, massed charges became suicide. By 1945, Japanese commanders adapted. General Kuribayashi on Iwo Jima built elaborate underground fortresses designed to survive naval bombardment and force Americans into costly tunnel fighting. No more banzai charges, just brutal attrition. Japanese rifles, the Type 38 and Type 99 Arisaka, were decent but unremarkable. Japanese machine guns were the weak point. The Type 11 and Type 96 suffered from complex feed mechanisms that jammed easily. Reliability was poor. The Japanese never prioritized submachine guns. The Type 100 was issued only to paratroopers in small numbers. In jungle fighting, Japanese infantry with bolt-action rifles faced Americans with Thompsons, BARs, and M1 carbines. The firepower gap was decisive. Japanese training emphasized bayonet fighting, relating the bayonet to the samurai katana. Many soldiers received only 3 months of training before being thrown into combat. Discipline was brutal. Officers beat men who failed standards, but no amount of discipline or fighting spirit could overcome industrial reality. Japan's production was a fraction of America's. They couldn't replace losses. They couldn't supply forces adequately. By 1945, Japanese soldiers were starving in jungles, cut off from supply, still fighting. Brave, determined. But bravery doesn't stop flamethrower tanks or naval bombardment, and one by one, every island fell. So which of these armies was actually the best? The answer depends on how you define best. Early war, the Wehrmacht was unmatched. Superior tactics, veteran NCOs, decentralized command, chemical enhancement. Poland conquered in weeks. France in 6 weeks. Nearly knocked the Soviet Union out in 6 months. No other army could match their adaptability and aggression. By 1942, everyone was learning. American infantry gaining experience. British mastering combined arms. Soviets becoming veterans. Germans still superior man for man, but being ground down by attrition. By 1945, the Red Army had the most experience. They'd survived the Eastern Front, mastered operational warfare, had more artillery than anyone. Americans had the best logistics, best equipment, most firepower. British had the most precise combined arms coordination. Colonel Trevor Dupuis' analysis confirmed it. German soldiers inflicted 50% more casualties than they took throughout the war, even when outnumbered, even when defending, even when losing. Man for man, the Wehrmacht was the most effective. But wars aren't won man for man. They're won by systems. The Americans and Soviets didn't need better soldiers. They just needed more soldiers, more bullets, and more time. 5 armies, 5 different ways of fighting. Germans mastered tactics but lost to attrition. Americans mastered logistics and buried enemies under steel. Soviets transformed from disaster to juggernaut through brutal experience. British fought with precision born from necessity. Japanese fought with fanaticism that couldn't overcome industrial physics. The lesson isn't that one army was best. Germany had the most effective soldiers man for man, but ran out of men. The Allies had worse soldiers early on, but overwhelming industry, endless logistics, and time to adapt. And in the end, that's what mattered. Could any army have beaten the Americans and Soviets once their industries mobilized? Or was the outcome inevitable the moment the US entered? Drop your thoughts in the comments. If you want more tactical breakdowns of World War II, hit subscribe. Thanks for watching.